This is not education that promotes sexual activity, certainly not early sexual activity.
We are against a mandate that is eliminating school board choice and taking authority away from parents.
One of the most controversial issues on your ballot this fall is Referendum 90, a measure that would make comprehensive sex education mandatory in our K-12 schools statewide for the first time. Opponents gathered enough signatures to bring R90 to a public vote. Now you get the final say on this highly emotional and contentious issue.
Opting out is technically allowed, but realistically impossible.
There's been a lot of misinformation about what is actually being taught.
Should school districts be required to teach sex ed? Or is this the wrong approach for students? Reviewing Referendum 90, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Should sex education be mandatory statewide in public schools? That's the main question facing voters with Referendum 90 this fall, but it's an issue that has a lot more questions attached to it. Advocates say R90 would provide age-appropriate, medically accurate information as a way to help students and families prevent sex abuse, unwanted pregnancies, and STDs. But opponents say the measure promotes sex ed lessons that are far from appropriate and takes local control away from school districts. Now it's your turn to decide if a new bill on sex education makes the grade.
So pregnancy, how it happens?
If you thought understanding sex education was a challenge as a kid, it's clear the grown-ups, at least in Washington state, are still having some issues too.
This is something that is long overdue.
Leah Griffin is a teacher, sexual assault survivor, and advocate who's volunteering to support Referendum 90 on your ballot this November, which would mandate sex education for all our state's school districts.
This creates a program for sexual health education in our schools.
The referendum is a vote to approve or reject Senate Bill 5395, which passed the legislature and was signed into law this spring, after strong opposition from Senate Republicans.
This is a misguided policy at its very core.
I'm not sure I can think of anything more important than teaching our kids compassion.
A yes vote on R90 would direct school districts to teach age-appropriate, comprehensive sex ed starting in kindergarten, something Leah says students desperately need, with 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys in our state reporting some form of sex abuse or assault before they graduate.
I know that the most impactful thing that we can do in Washington state to prevent sexual violence is to teach consent education in our schools.
The state school's superintendent has a list of approved sex ed materials that districts would choose from if voters pass R90. If approved, grades K through 3 wouldn't learn about sex, but would learn about social and emotional health and setting boundaries with their bodies. Later elementary grades would discuss puberty, and high schoolers would focus on how to avoid disease, pregnancy, and sexual assault.
What we're really trying to do is make sure that all Washington students have the information that they need to prevent these unwanted outcomes.
The Approve R90 campaign has raised more than $1.1 million as of early October and is endorsed by the Washington Education Association, the Sexual Violence Law Center, and Planned Parenthood. The vast majority of school districts in our state already teach some form of sex ed, and Griffin points out that if families don't want the information, they can opt their kids out.
This isn't a one curriculum fits all option. What is really great about this bill is it gives so much autonomy and ability for parents to be involved.
Opponents, who gathered more than twice the signatures needed to get R90 on the ballot, see the measure completely differently.
We are against a mandate that is eliminating school board choice and taking authority away from parents.
Kim Wendt, a former fighter pilot and mom of 4, helped found the political action group Informed Parents of Washington, which Wendt says doesn't oppose sex ed, but does oppose the way it could be taught if R90 passes.
When you go and you look at what the curriculum says, you'll see it actually sexualizes children.
Kim says the state's accepted curricula on comprehensive sex education, with lessons about sexual consent and enjoyment, push kids towards sex at an early age.
So my fear is that this is actually grooming children for sex, which to me is teaching kids how to say yes to sex well below the age of that is legal to even do that in this state.
The Reject R90 campaign, led by Parents for Safe Schools, has raised more than $252,000 as of early October and is endorsed by the Washington Republican Party, the pro-life nonprofit Human Life of Washington, and the faith-based Family Policy Institute. Opponents point out that a 2019 state superintendent's poll showed 58% of parents did not support requiring sex ed from grades K through 12. Kim would rather give families the choice to opt in rather than opt out of sex education.
If the parents want it, then they need to get the school board to put it in the curriculum.
Does comprehensive sex ed destigmatize sex and help kids, or desensitize kids and hurt them? It's your decision with R90.
There is common ground here, and we can work together to find it. And so that's what I hope will happen when this bill gets rejected.
The single most impactful thing that we can do in this state to prevent sexual violence is to approve Referendum 90.
And joining us to debate this issue, we have with us Courtney Normand. She is here for Approve Referendum 90. She is the State Director of Planned Parenthood Votes, Northwest and Hawaii. On the Reject R90 side, Beth Daranciang. She is speaking on behalf of the PAC Informed Parents of Washington. Thanks to you both for being here. I'm going to jump right into this. We had a coin flip before the show, and Beth, you're up first. Why do you oppose this measure? What do you want voters to know about it?
Yes, well, the SB 5395 is a statewide mandate for all districts that they use a certain method of comprehensive sex ed that many people disagree with and don't want to use. Many districts don't want to use. And it's a mandate that they say that there's options, but actually it's kind of like pizza and saying that you can have pepperoni pizza, you can order it from any vendor you want, but you can only have pepperoni pizza. Just like that, CSE is a certain method of sexuality education. And the sexuality education would be dictated by standards that are controlled by unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats. 266,000 people signed a petition to put this on the ballot because they wanted to reject R90.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we'll dive into some of those points that you brought up a bit later on. Courtney, why do you support Referendum 90? I can give you about a minute as well.
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me today. My name is Courtney Normand, and I'm a mother of 2 children who are in schools here in Washington State. I'm also really proud to be representing the approved side of this issue. Washington State has had standards in place for about 13 years about comprehensive sex education. And this covers a wide range of topics from human development, growth, and puberty, through pregnancy prevention, information about abstinence and birth control, sexually transmitted infection. What's been often left out there is information about healthy relationships and violence prevention, sexual assault and abuse prevention. And it's also not always been very inclusive of all youth, especially of protected class statuses in our state. So for about 13 years, Washington has had an if-then law saying that if schools are going to be participating in sex education, then they need to be meeting some standards that at least 20 years of research show us are really effective in getting the health outcomes that we need for young people. So now we have a new law that we are hoping to uphold by approving Referendum 90 in order to make sure that all school districts participate, not just some. We don't want to be leaving youth in the dark from this really vital information.
Got it. Thanks very much. Courtney, let me stick with you here, and I'm going to bring up the point that Beth brought up here. More than 266,000 people signed on to this petition to get the referendum on the ballot. Opponents are saying that the state isn't listening to them when it comes to sex education. How do you respond to that criticism and the overwhelming number of people who signed on for this referendum, for that reject vote?
Sure. Well, one thing we know is that nationally and in Washington State, a strong majority of parents do want to see our schools required to offer comprehensive sex education. Parents know that our communities and our schools are a really vital voice here and need to be part of that conversation so young people have this information in a factual, honest way. So we know that the public support is there. We also know that there were 2 years of legislative sessions happening here with several hearings, lots of stakeholder input, lots of folks calling the legislature and communicating. And our elected representatives looked at the information, they looked at the guidance that the state had already been working with, and they made a decision, and the governor signed that law. And now where we're at is that it's on a referendum. So again, voters can tell us what they think about comprehensive sex education.
Okay, thank you for that. Beth, I'll go to you now. As we're all aware, the vast majority of schools in our state offer some sort of sex ed, but there are 1 or 2 dozen school districts who reported to the state in a survey they have no sex education program. So supporters of Referendum 90 would say it's simply trying to make sure every child in the state has access to the same information, doesn't matter what zip code you're in. How do you respond to that?
Several things. One is that because the state mandates that only comprehensive sexuality education can be used, many districts had sex education before that they were happy with, that the parents in the district had approved, but that was not allowed anymore by OSPI under these new standards in 2007. So that's why some districts have opted out, unfortunately, because they haven't had the choice they wanted. And to Courtney's point about parents approving this, actually, they did a survey, and over 10,000 people in Washington state responded, mostly parents, and 58% were against comprehensive sexuality education. And that was OSPI's own survey that was done just earlier this year, or last year, yes. Yes.
Okay, very good point. Oh, sorry, keep going, Beth. Yeah.
Hundreds of people came to many of the committee hearings, thousands over the course of weeks of the hearings, both last year and this year. And I would say of the people that were not paid to be there, that were not there in a staff position at all, there was more than 100 to 1 against this bill. There were very few volunteers, parents, citizens that were there supporting this bill, and hundreds and tens of thousands of emails that the lawmakers got against this bill, almost none for it.
Beth, let me stick with you here and really drill down on a point here that I think is important. The approved side would say there's a lot of leeway for parents here. They're free to opt out of sex ed classes for their student if they so choose. If that's available, what's the problem?
Well, the problem is that opting out is technically allowed, but realistically impossible. Because one, often school districts and schools make it difficult for parents. They have to go to a only offered once a year meeting and look at the curriculum and sign up. And if they miss that meeting, they can't opt out. Secondly, it's impossible to opt out of the culture that this creates in the schools. Because other kids are going to talk about it in the classroom. And that was even discussed by Lori Dills at OSPI, that she hopes that kids who miss out by opting out will hear about it in the hallways and at recess. And so there really isn't an option. Besides, kids talk about the possibility and the likelihood of being bullied or teased for being opted out, for having to walk out of the classroom during that time. It's just very difficult. So it's realistically not likely.
Fair enough. Courtney, I want to make sure I get your response here, this idea that it's not really possible practically for kids and families to opt out of this.
Sure. Well, I'm glad you asked about that, because for at least 13 years, Washington state law has required several things for school districts in this area. One is that all parents must be notified at least 30 days in advance before any instruction is provided. And actually, curriculum is available at all times. Parents can request to review curriculum at any time. It's true there are often meetings where there's a presentation provided, but parents, again, can look at the curriculum anytime. And there are a variety of curriculum. When school districts are looking into what curriculum they would like to adopt, they are actually required to involve the community in that process. And lastly, For parents who are not interested in participation here, that opt-out has been in place again since passage of the Healthy Youth Act in 2007. And in fact, with Senate Bill 5395 and approved Referendum 90, we actually saw that strengthened to clarify that when requested, the opt-out must be granted. I also think it's really important to note that on the survey from OSPI, that was not a scientific survey. That was based off of who could organize, who could send in the comments. So it's also important to consider the sound research that goes into where we're getting folks' opinions from.
Let me jump in just to interrupt for a brief second here, Courtney, because I really do think this is part of the pushback I'm hearing from opponents, is that it sexualizes kids at a younger age. And I realize that R90 aims to be age appropriate and would not include traditional sex ed as we knew it in middle school there in those grades K through 3. But I think when people hear kindergarten and they hear comprehensive sex ed in the same sentence, they get concerned. And I wanted to talk about that and why kids this young are involved in a measure like this.
Yes, it's not just aiming to be age appropriate. It's required in the law to be age appropriate.
Right.
And that's not just a matter of opinion. There are guidelines provided that have been in place, K through 12, showing what we're talking about grade by grade for this content. For K through 3, it's also specified, and it's right there in the ballot language, that it is social and emotional learning. We're talking about young people learning how to understand and manage their emotions, set and achieve positive goals, learn the characteristics of a friend and how to ask someone to be your friend. Again, it's required to be age appropriate at all stages along the way.
Got it. Courtney, Beth, let me jump to you here. I want to pick up on a point that Courtney made earlier here. With more sexual abuse, with more unwanted sexual attention reported by high schoolers out there, the rise in STDs in recent years we talked about in the setup piece, the Approved 90 side would tell you there's some urgency here. We need comprehensive sex education. What's your reaction to those rising numbers there, Beth?
Yes, you're right that there has been a rise in STDs, and that is very concerning. But you know, in King County, which has had comprehensive sex ed in Flash, in the form of Flash for the longest time, actually has the highest rates of STDs and rising. So obviously the comprehensive sex ed is not reducing those rates and may even be increasing them. And we actually think that they are increasing the STD rates.
Got it. Courtney, I want to make sure that you respond to that. This idea that comprehensive sex ed, as we see it in King County right now, is somehow responsible in some ways, or at least is not turning the tide when it comes to these issues like STDs, et cetera.
Well, there are 20 or 30 years of research on sex education. I did my master's capstone project on this topic a while back. And Congress even ordered a study comparing abstinence-only approaches to sex education with comprehensive sex education. And what they show time and time and time again, including in our own state's health impact review of SB 5395, is that when young people have the information that they need provided to them in an honest way about informed decision-making, and what are the facts when it comes to reproduction, when it comes to sexuality, and when it comes to relationships, the outcomes are better across the board. We see that young people are actually delaying the first time they engage in sexual activity. And when or if they are engaging, they end up communicating more with their partner about their relationship. They make informed decisions, which result in higher rates of contraception use, condom use, lower rates of unintended pregnancy. There are many, many studies, both in our state and nationally, that all show us this information. I think it's really critical that we be thinking about our shared values of keeping young people safe and healthy, and that we want to look to the information that tells us what's evidence-based here to actually get the outcomes we're looking for.
Got it. Beth, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of that evidence out there. 4 of the states with the highest teenage birth rates as of 2017, Arkansas, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Louisiana, all stressed abstinence in sexual education. And then as it turns out, teen pregnancy rates in those states are some of the highest in the country. And so that's an issue, I think. And I wonder about that. This whole concept of abstinence is important. I know it's taught in the R90 curricula as well. But your thoughts about that a lot of the data might not support what you're talking about here.
Actually, comprehensive sexuality education, like I said, is a certain method of sexuality education that focus on pleasure. Actually, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which helped draft comprehensive sex education, says that our approach includes an emphasis on sexual expression, sexual fulfillment, and sexual pleasure. This represents a shift away from methodologies that focus exclusively on the reproductive aspects of adolescent sexuality. So obviously, these are emphases that most parents do not want in the public schools. Emphasis on sexual pleasure, sexual expression for their kids, especially at young ages. For example, one of the curricula gives different options to prevent STDs. And some of those options are to engage, this is for 7th graders, okay, 12-year-olds, 12, 13-year-olds, that to engage in mutual masturbation or to bathe together. Now, if you ask most parents across Washington State whether they want their 7th graders to be taught that bathing together is a safe activity, they would say no.
Okay. I want to make sure Courtney responds to this, because getting into the weeds here a little bit with some of the curricula is a part of this conversation for sure. But I think the basic point here that you're hearing, Courtney, is that somehow the education that's being provided here with comprehensive sex education is somehow grooming kids to have sex at an early age. I wanted to talk about that, maybe also talking about the ideas of affirmative consent, which I know are a part of this too. Courtney, please go ahead.
Sure. I think that's been one of the most difficult parts of this issue and this ballot measure for parents across our state. There's been a lot of misinformation about what is actually being taught and what is in the curriculum. I want to be very, very clear. There isn't the curriculum. There is a set of guidelines for schools to look at. Every school is required to work with their community to find the curriculum or even to design the curriculum that works best for their community. That's required. Again, it's required to be age appropriate. The Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction routinely reviews the different curricula that are available, and they provide an assessment based off of those standards that I mentioned earlier. Without getting too far into the weeds, the fact of the matter is that we have content that's available for parents to review. And I think what you're going to see most often, and what they tell us at OSPI, is that when families check in and they do review these, they're often very pleasantly surprised. Again, we're talking about human growth and development. We're talking about reproduction. We're talking about informed decision making, the social emotional learning that it takes place for people to be having out loud conversations about their values and making sound decisions with their partners and their relationships. It shows us time and time again that the outcomes are better for young people's safety and for their health.
Got it. Courtney, let me stick with you. I wanted to make sure I brought up one piece here. When it comes to the reject side, they have raised concerns about R90 being an unfunded mandate. What do you say to that? What do you want voters to know about that piece?
Sure. Well, there was no fiscal note when the legislature assessed this legislation. And often when you're looking at a curriculum process, what you'll find is a school district adopts that, and then they hold on to that curriculum for several years. With comprehensive sex education, it's very often part of other health curricula that a district will purchase, so there isn't an additional cost to access those materials. But there's more good news, which is that there are many free and low-cost curricula available, and there's even a new curriculum being developed as we speak in one of our school districts that received a grant. They are designing it, in the event that we do approve Referendum 90 and this passes. This curriculum will be free to any schools in our state, and it will be in accordance with the law. I think it's also really important to say once more, schools don't have to take the entire, here's this entire textbook and we're going to go from page 1 to page 150.
Yeah.
They can select the chapters that work best, again, in conversation with their communities.
Got it. I wanted to make sure, Beth, that you responded to that, if you'd like, with regard to the unfunded mandate piece, or however you want to look at this. Any sort of response to what Courtney was saying there? I can give you about 30, 45 seconds on that.
Yes, well, they talk about school districts being able to develop their own curriculum, but that's a very expensive proposition. And most school districts are dealing with a lot of budget cuts at this point. So that's just not realistic. So they'll be choosing from the curricula that have been approved by OSPI, and we can see those on the website. And I have to say that when the reason that 266,000 people were motivated, and all of those signatures were gathered by volunteers, which is almost unprecedented. The reason they're motivated is because they saw parts of the curriculum, at least parts, some much of it, and they said, this is not right. We cannot be forcing our kids to go through this curriculum. It's wrong. And I have to say that in the hearings, there was a couple of middle school girls who came and talked about their experience in 6th and 7th grade having CSE at their schools. And they said that having the sexuality education in their classes was it was so graphic, it was degrading, but also it led to conversations in the hallway where boys were teasing them about the homework and bringing up topics that they didn't want to discuss. And the boys wouldn't stop it, and they felt degraded and humiliated, and that's wrong.
Got it. I want to make sure we have time to wrap up the show. I can give you about a minute here, Beth. Final words for voters about Referendum 90.
When the state passed 5395, they ignored hundreds of people who had come to Olympia to lobby against it. They ignored tens of thousands of emails by parents and other concerned citizens across the state. And to reject this state-mandated curriculum with standards by unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats that would mandate a curriculum that teaches graphic sexuality to the youngest kids. And even they opposed the sexuality education at the middle school and high school levels as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Courtney, you get the last word here.
Sure. Again, as a parent of 2 children in our public school system, and as a lifelong advocate for reproductive rights and the rights of all young people, I think this issue is really about dignity and honoring our young people when they tell us that they need information for healthier relationships, for reporting abuse, for having a better future and graduation rates. We know that there are many people really interested in this issue. It's the only statewide ballot measure in this election. We're very proud to be part of a coalition of over 115 community organizations in Washington and over 100 faith leaders to say we vote to approve Referendum 90. And again, we want to be there for safe and healthy youth in our state. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you both very much for this discussion, and we will be right back. How are people responding to Referendum 90 on social media? One commenter says, "I think sex ed should be taught by parents and not the schools. My youngest is way too young for this." Another says, "The best reason to approve 90 is to break the cycle of domestic violence before it turns another generation of our children into victims or perpetrators or both." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattle.gov or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, the gubernatorial race in Washington. Governor Jay Inslee is seeking a 3rd term and will face Republican challenger Lauren Culp this November. We hear from both candidates, plus the heads of the state Democratic and Republican parties, next week on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.